When looking at a passage, it's good to determine the author's main point and their purpose. So another term for main point would be main idea. So basically, this is what the author is trying to convey. It's the most important information that the author is trying to convey to the reader. Then there's purpose. This is why the author is trying to convey the information. So we could say that the main point is the what, and the purpose is the why. Because the purpose is what the author is hoping to achieve by sharing the information with you. So purpose is the why behind the what. Purpose is the reason you're sharing the what. So an example of this would be that an author's main point could be that yellow lights should be longer. And their premises for that, or what backs up their belief about that, is that longer yellow lights will save lives through reduced traffic accidents. So the purpose here, the reason that the author would share this main point with you and the evidence behind it, is to make you also believe that yellow lights should be longer. So that's just an elementary example of that. So we have a passage right here, and we're not going to look for the purpose in this main passage. We're just going to look at the author's main point. So this says, people need to appreciate public schools. The school year should be increased by 2 weeks. This would allow for increased instruction in core subject areas. This would also shorten the summer break, which would lessen the amount of time for students to forget what they learned. So, this first sentence here says people need to appreciate public schools. So, could that be a conclusion or a main point? Another word for main point is a conclusion. So we have main point, and then I'll put in parentheses here, conclusion. And then we have premises that back up a main point. This is basically kind of the evidence or the reasons behind that main point. So, could this be a main point? Yes, but let's keep moving on and see if that's really the main point of this passage. The next sentence says the school year should be increased by 2 weeks. Could that be a main point? Absolutely. Now, remember, a main point needs to have premises, things to back it up, facts, figures, arguments, anything like that to back it up. Okay? So, these next two sentences talk about why it'd be good to increase the school year by 2 weeks. They don't talk about why people need to appreciate public schools more. So these two sentences, these last two sentences are basically premises backing up this sentence right here, saying the school year should be increased by 2 weeks. So this second sentence here is the main point. This first sentence is really a distractor. Now, in kind of a roundabout way, if the school year was increased by 2 weeks, then maybe people would begin to appreciate public schools more and begin to appreciate all that they're teaching children. But that's kind of a roundabout way, and these two premises right here relate more directly to this sentence here than they do this first sentence. So premises can be thought of as the foundations or the building blocks for the main point. Without premises, a main point crumbles because there's nothing to back it up. So you have to have those premises. So that's a look at author's main point or purpose.
Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you can look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay, we were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky unfamiliar word.
Many times readers come across words that they are unfamiliar with. So it's important that readers understand how to determine the definition of a word based on its context. This means looking at the words around it and how the word is used in the sentence. Let's look at a couple of examples. This first example says, the elderly scholar spent his evenings hunched over arcane text that few other people even knew existed. So the unfamiliar word here is arcane, but you will see that you can pretty much determine the definition of that word based on the words around it. Here we see the word elderly coming before scholar. So if only an elderly scholar would be studying these texts, then it means that it must be some kind of complex subject that only someone who has acquired much knowledge and wisdom would understand. And then we also see that it says that few other people even knew existed. So that means it's something rare or something that only a few people would know about. So here we have easily and quickly determined the definition of arcane. This next sentence says, Ron's fealty to his parents was not shared by Karen, who disobeyed their every command. Now you'll notice here that there's not very many words that tell us the definition of fealty. Instead, we see words that tell us what fealty is not. Because here it says, Karen who disobeyed their every command. Here, Ron is being contrasted with Karen. So if fealty is not disobeying their every command, then fealty must mean obeying or being faithful to. Because notice here we're seeing that Karen disobeys their every command, but Ron does not. So Ron must mean not disobeying. In other words, it means obeying. So you see here how by looking at context clues, a reader can quickly determine the definition of a word. And although it may not be the exact definition, it generally will be the definition for that word in that particular sentence. And so this can be very helpful because it helps a reader be more efficient, because determining the definition of a word based on context is much quicker than consulting a dictionary or a thesaurus.
Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples, and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, that one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate, but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Interpretation of expository or literary text. Well, to determine what your interpretation of a work is going to be, first let's refresh ourselves on what expository and literary text are. Expository writing is going to be something that informs, explains, or describes. It's going to be very cut and dry. There's not a plot. It's basically there to explain something to you, tell you how to do something, give instructions. A science research paper would be an example. Baking instructions for baking a cake. Anything like that would be expository. So what you want to do is outline the basic elements of that paper, and then you want to evaluate their effectiveness. This is how you are going to give your interpretation. Once you outline the basic elements of the research paper or the recipe, then you can evaluate their effectiveness. Did you learn what you were supposed to learn from the research paper? Are you now able to bake a cake following those directions? Very cut and dry. Literary is a little bit different. Literary works are going to be your narratives, essays, works of fiction. These are going to have a plot. There's going to be more that you will have to go through, and because there will be so much more to the literary works, you want to focus on just one aspect to give your interpretation. You don't want to try to cover all of the elements because that would be too much and you wouldn't really get to put your personal interpretation on all of the different aspects of that work. So, some aspects you could choose from are the topic of the story, major characters in the story, major events, the setting, structure, point of view, use of language, or tone. Any of these would work. Pick one, focus on that one, and what you're going to do is explained here. An interpretation should both describe the text and elaborate upon it. So, say we were to choose major characters. You would want to describe what's in the text and elaborate upon it. And I've put that into a few steps here for you. So, to describe the text, introduce the major characters. In your interpretation, describe the major characters. What do they look like? What are their attitudes? How has the author described them in the text? Then, explain how the author portrays them. Are they liked by other characters? Are they meant to be a villain or a hero? Are they just an everyday Joe? How does the author portray these characters? And then discuss what the author's purpose was. Why did the author portray them that way? What did the author want to get across to readers? And because this is an interpretation, there are going to be several different answers. There's no one right answer, because no one is going to know exactly what the author's purpose was. You're giving your interpretation, what you think the author meant. So you'll describe everything that the author put in the book about the characters, and then you'll elaborate upon what the author put in there by telling what you think the author was trying to tell, what the author's theme was, what their purpose was for showing characters in a certain light. So when you are interpreting a text with expository, you want to remember to just outline the basic elements and evaluate their effectiveness. Were you able to bake that cake? Did you learn what you were supposed to from the research paper? With literary works, you want to focus on one aspect out of all the different things you could focus on in a literary text. Pick one, just one, and then describe that one from the text, what the author actually said, and elaborate upon it. Go through and give your opinion on it, what you think the author meant. And the thing is, it's an interpretation. Everyone's is going to be a little different. Not everyone's going to pick the same aspect to focus on, and not everyone's going to elaborate upon it the same way. So since the author knew he was writing to lots of different readers whenever he or she created this work, try to make your interpretation unique. Prefixes, suffixes, and root words. Have you ever been reading a book and come across a word that you've never seen before? Well, if you can break that word down into prefixes, suffixes, and root words, then you can probably figure out what the word means. For instance, orthography may be a word you've never seen before. But if we break it down into its prefix, ortho, its root word, graph, and its suffix, y, then we might be able to figure out what the word means. Ortho means correct or straight. Graph means write or draw. And Y means the state or condition of. So if we put all those together, we can get the state of being written correctly. And when we compare the definition we came up with our actual definition, you can see they're pretty close. The state of being written correctly, writing words using the proper letters. So you got a pretty good idea just by breaking the words down into a prefix, a root word, and a suffix and figuring out what those meant. And even if you only knew graph had something to do with writing, you would have an idea that orthography had to do something with writing. Let's look at another example. Geometric. We'll break down into our prefix, geo, our root word, metra, and our suffix, ik. Geo means earth, and we put that with metra, which means measure, and ik means having to do with. So, if we put all of those together, we can come up with having to do with measuring the earth. Now this one isn't quite as close to the actual definition, relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles, but it does have measuring in there. You would be able to tell from the root word measure that geometric is going to have something to do with measuring. So if you ever come across a word that you don't know, first try to figure out what the prefix is, the root word is, and the suffix is, so that you can maybe get an idea of what the word means. You can see how important prefixes, suffixes, and root words are to understanding what a word means. Textual evidence for predictions. A prediction is an educated guess about what will come later in a text. Now, your predictions can be about an event or about how a character will behave. But any prediction you make must be based on information in the text or based on knowledge about literature in general. For instance, if you've seen how a character has acted in a story so far, you can make a prediction about his future actions. And with your knowledge about literature, you know the basic layout of a mystery novel, so you might be able to predict who did something in a story or how the story is going to end up based on your general knowledge of literature. And the more you read, the more your general knowledge about literature is going to increase, so you may be able to make more predictions the more you read. Now, one specific way that you might find textual support for prediction is with foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when the author hints at something that will occur later in the plot. So sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes the author doesn't say exactly what will happen. It may mention storm clouds on the horizon, and the storm clouds could equal danger or something bad happening. So if you have a character who is going through a tough time and then they see storm clouds on the horizon, or someone mentions a storm might be coming, then that may be the author's way of hinting that something bad is coming or danger is approaching. However, sometimes foreshadowing could be more direct, as in Romeo and Juliet. They talk about how they would rather die than live without one another. And that was William Shakespeare's way of hinting that in the end, when they thought that they might live without one another, they did end up killing themselves rather than live without the other one. Sometimes foreshadowing comes in the form of a fortune teller. There are a lot of stories that include a fortune teller or someone that happens to tell someone's fortune or tell their future even without being labeled a fortune teller. And they'll say exactly what's going to happen, and then later on, that's how the plot unfolds. Now, sometimes the author will throw in what's called a red herring. And that's when they tell you what's going to happen, but it doesn't really happen. So, when a hint or prediction by the author does not actually happen. So, you have to pay attention because sometimes the author may give you a direct foreshadowing example. They may go and say exactly what's going to happen, and that'll be true. But sometimes they'll give a really big hint, or they'll even lay out the prediction with a fortune teller, or by the characters just discussing how they feel like things are going to end up. But it's a red herring because that's not really how the author ends the story. So don't always think that if the author tells you something's going to happen, it's going to happen. But foreshadowing can often be a good textual support for any predictions you're going to make. So whenever you are making predictions while you're reading a story, make sure that your predictions are based on evidence either from the story itself, information in that text, or information that you've gained from reading other books and getting a general knowledge about literature. Textual support for interpretation. Whenever you're going to interpret a work, you are going to identify the author's methods, their tone, their use of language, their plot, major characters, setting. Then you're going to decide on one of those aspects of the writing, pick just one, and evaluate and analyze that one aspect. You want to give your opinion on what the author was trying to do with the use of this character or with the use of a certain tone. What was their purpose in doing that? But you want to make it stronger. And one way that you can make your evaluation, your interpretation of this work stronger is to root your interpretation in the text. That means you go through and you find specific examples in the text that support what your interpretation is. The examples from the text support your ideas. So it doesn't look like it's just things that you're coming up with out of your head. It's things that you came up with because of something specific in the story that made you think. So one thing you can look at is quotes. Look at what characters say. This could be something that affects the tone, or it could be something that reflects on a character, or it could be something specific letting you know what's happening in the plot. Look at details from this story. It could be how someone looks, so physical characteristics. It could be specific things that happen in the plot. It could have to do with the tone as well. It could have to do with specific language that the author used. But find those details and then put them into your evaluation. Find these quotes and put them into your interpretation. So if you're trying to describe how a character acts or how you felt about a character, go back and find something specific about that character in the story and put it into your interpretation so that your essay now has roots in the text and is going to be stronger. Another thing you can do, which isn't going to pull information directly from the text you read, but is going to make your work stronger, is to find statistics or facts relating to your topic. Now, this could be, if you're writing about cell phones, you might say, a lot of people use cell phones. Well, instead of using that general phrase, you could give an actual number of people who use cell phones. Or if it's people using cell phones while driving, or while at home, or while at work, or under or over a certain age, you could look up that statistic and put it into your paper. And it's going to help because it makes things more precise. It shows you did your research. It shows you aren't just making things up from your head. You are actually going out and finding this information somewhere. The same way that you giving your opinion of a character or of the theme of a work is based on the quotes that you find or details that you find in the writing. So whenever you are giving an interpretive essay, you want to find textual support for that interpretation. Identifying the author's methods, finding one aspect to focus on, and evaluating and analyzing that is all important, but to make it even stronger, you want to root your interpretation in the text.
When someone infers something, it means they form a conclusion about something the author has not actually stated by making logical deductions from things he has stated. So, if you were to just read the first part of this definition, you might think that an inference is a guess, because the first part of this definition says forming a conclusion about something the author has not actually stated. So, while that is what an inference is, you also base an inference on things the author has stated. So it's not just something that you're making up. You're basing it on logical reasoning, or you're coming to this conclusion from logical deductions. Basically, you're reading in between the lines. Now, infer is closely related to the word imply. Imply and infer are flip sides of the same coin. An author implies something by suggesting it without saying it directly, and then a reader infers what the author is trying to imply. So this passage up here says, the saying that job applicants should dress for success is not far from the truth. An interviewer's first impression of a job candidate will be based on what they see. The interviewer will most likely process a resume in light of that first impression. The nicer someone dresses, the more serious they probably are about a job. So, after you read this passage, you're now faced with a question. The author would most likely agree that. And then you have several options here. So there will be many times when you have to read a passage and then answer a question about it. And so a lot of times the question will be something like the author would most likely agree that, or the researchers would most likely concur with which one of the following, or the argument most strongly supports which one of the following, or which one of the following can be properly inferred from the passage above. Any of those are all relating to this same core question. What can you infer from this passage? So A says women do better than men in interviews. So we have to make a distinction here between things that are true and things that can be backed up by the passage we just read. So women may actually do better than men in interviews. I haven't seen the statistics on it. So just say, for example, that this is true. Women do better than men in interviews. This is still not a correct answer because we're trying to make an inference from this passage up here. And the author never talks about women versus men in interviews. So we cannot go with A. B says interview questions should focus more on achievements than goals. Well, I mean, that makes sense that you should ask a candidate about their past achievements rather than their future goals. But again, there's nothing to back it up, no evidence for that. C says job applicants who dress nicely feel more confident. That sounds good. That's probably true. And that seems to be supported by this. Because you think, if you dress for success, then you'll be more confident. That may be what this phrase is kind of saying, is that you'll feel more confident if you dress for success. But nothing else in this passage backs up C. Overall, this passage is not about the job applicant feeling more confident. It's more about the impression their dress gives to a potential employer or the interviewer. So we come to D. So pretty much we can already conclude that D is correct by process of elimination. But we don't want to just stop there. We want to go ahead and dive into this and see if D really is the correct answer. So it says, a male job applicant should make sure his tie and shirt match. Now you may be thinking, this passage never talks about matching or ties or shirts, but this is still the correct answer. Because remember, we're talking about making a good first impression. This last sentence says, the nicer someone dresses, the more serious they probably are about a job. So one way to dress nice is to be matching. And you match well, and you look nice, you make a good first impression, and you dress for success. So D is the correct answer. Many times it is important to be able to identify two words that are synonyms. Now, some words are perfect synonyms, and other words are nearly synonyms. Rarely are you going to find perfect synonyms because you're not going to be able to generally find two words that have the same definition. So generally what you're looking for are two words that are nearly synonyms, meaning they have almost the same definition. So we have the word superfluous up here on the board, which means more than needed. So if I ask you how your day was going, and you said my day has been wonderful, extraordinary, out of this world, unbelievable, I could say that you were being superfluous in your description of your day because you were using more words than needed. So we need to find a synonym that goes along with this word. So we have A, which says senseless. So it is senseless to use more words than needed. So we'll put a star next to A because that could be it. B says unique. Unique and superfluous definitely are not synonyms. We come to C, which says excessive. That's a pretty good synonym for superfluous. D is unwanted. We could say that superfluous means unwanted because if you use more words than necessary, then you could say some of those words are unwanted. But I would say that excessive is a closer synonym than unwanted. So we'll X that out as well. Then we come to E, which means obstinate. That obviously is not a synonym for superfluous. So we come down to senseless and excessive. And so we're not going to find a word that means exactly the same thing as superfluous, but we can find a word that is very close. So we're looking for the closest synonym. And so some people might disagree with me here, but I'm going to say that C is the closest synonym to superfluous. So we're going to go with C, which is the word excessive. So remember, you're not finding two words that have exactly the same definition, but instead you want to go through the words you're provided with and mark off the ones you know are wrong, and then narrow it down a little bit, and then from there decide which word you think is a synonym of the word you're looking at. Noticing an author's position is very vital to understanding a piece of writing, because every writer is going to have a personal bias, or they're going to have a certain position on whatever they're writing about. So the way they portray something in their writing may not be totally accurate. So it's vital that you as a reader understand the author's position so that you can better understand their work of writing. So first of all, the author's position is basically their stance on the issue at hand. It's what they believe about the issue they are writing about. So to help you find the author's position, you need to notice several things. Notice each point here starts with the word notice, because to find the author's position, you can't just sit back and have it come to you. You as the reader are going to have to be proactive and notice these things. So first of all, notice personal opinions. So this is basically noticing when someone is interjecting their own thoughts about something instead of actually putting fact in there. Notice bias. This is when someone words a sentence or a paragraph so that they portray something as being good or maybe portray something else as being bad. In other words, they're not giving fact anymore. The way they word something casts something into a negative light or makes something look very good or very positive. Also, notice emotional language. This is when a writer puts their own thoughts into something or their own opinions into something, and then by using strong emotional language, tries to sway the reader over to their thinking. Now remember, again, we're not talking about a persuasive paper, because persuasive papers are always going to have a certain author's position in it, because that's the idea of a persuasive paper, that the author is trying to sway you a certain way. So we're not focusing on persuasive papers, focusing on other kinds of papers when the author really isn't supposed to have a bias, when they're not supposed to have a position on the issue. But nevertheless, they are going to have a position. And so sometimes they'll insert emotional language to try to persuade someone to their thinking. Then also, notice what information is left out. Because when we're talking about personal opinions, bias, and emotional language, these are all things that are going to be added to the paper. This is something an author may add to the paper to insert their bias or to insert their own position. But noticing what is left out is when the author doesn't write something to support their position. This may be some fact that would look bad upon their own position, so they just leave it out. So sometimes it's hard to know what is left out because it's not there. And if you don't know anything else about the topic at hand, you may not know what pertinent information is being left out. But sometimes that can be helpful to understanding the author's position. So the important thing to take away from this is that the author's position is their stance on the issue at hand. And any piece of writing that is out there, the author who wrote it is going to have a position on that subject. So it's up to you as the reader to determine how strong that position is portrayed in the paper, and to notice anytime anything is skewed or the facts are twisted a little bit, and when the author is trying to persuade you to believe like they do. You, as the reader, should always be drawing conclusions. So I'm going to write that point up here on the board. Always be drawing conclusions. In many cases, the conclusion of a writing will not be stated directly, and you will have to infer it from the information you already know and the information you are gathering from the text. So those situations are very difficult, and it's vital that you are always drawing conclusions because you never know when the right time to draw that conclusion will be. In this case, we're talking about conclusions that are stated directly, and these are much easier to find. However, you don't know where in the paper you are going to find this conclusion that is stated directly. Read this sentence. It is always more comfortable to draw conclusions from information stated within a passage rather than to draw them from mere implications. So when we're talking about drawing them from mere implications, that's called inferring. Now, when you're able to draw conclusions from information stated within a passage, that's talking about when a conclusion is stated directly. So these kinds of passages are pretty easy because the information is going to be stated directly. The important thing here is that you read the entire passage. Even though the conclusion is stated directly, you still have to find it. And sometimes there may be another sentence in the passage that looks like the conclusion, and so you may see that sentence and think, okay, this is the conclusion, I found it. But then right after that sentence, the author will then be offering a rebuttal to that proposed conclusion, shutting it down and giving a counter-argument, leading up to the author revealing the best conclusion. So it's important that you read the entire passage so that you can be sure that the conclusion you find is the same one the author intended for you to find. When defining words found in a text, often words have a definition that is more than the dictionary definition. So we can say that words have two definitions, a denotative meaning and a connotative meaning. The denotative meaning is the literal meaning of the word. So basically, if you're wondering what the word meant and it's the denotative meaning, then you could just look up the word in the dictionary, and the dictionary definition would describe the meaning of that word. However, the connotative meaning of the word also involves the emotional reaction a word may invoke. It depends on the reader's associations they may make with that word. So it goes further than the denotative meaning. And so denotative meanings are generally used in nonfiction works. Whenever in a nonfiction work the writer isn't trying to be flowery or use figurative language, so the actual definition of the word is what the word means in that context. However, in fiction works, the connotative meaning of a word also is often meant. So it's important that readers learn to differentiate between when the connotative or denotative word or denotative meaning is being used. And so the reader can usually determine by the context clues whether the author is using the denotative or connotative meaning of a word. When a reader comes across an unfamiliar word, it's important that they know techniques to understanding the word's definition. One way to determine a word's definition is by looking at the prefix and suffix of the word. Although there are many words in the English language, many of those words share a common prefix or suffix. So by understanding the meaning of that prefix or suffix, the reader can then determine the likely meaning of the word. So one way to determine word meaning is structural analysis, and that's by looking at the prefix, the root, and the suffix, all of a word. So take the word unacceptable, for example. Here you have the root word, accept. Because that can be a word in itself. And then here you have the prefix, un, and the suffix, able. The prefix is always going to come before the root word, and the suffix is always going to come after the root word. Now, notice I said the root word is the word that can stand alone. I understand that able can also stand alone and is a word, but in this case it's a suffix. So if you saw un or able written by themselves, you would see it written like this. That's because the dash represents the word. So here, since un is a prefix, the word comes after the prefix. And here with able, the word comes before able because able is the suffix. So say you didn't understand what unacceptable meant. Well, you could look at able, and you know that means able pretty much. And so you know acceptable must mean able to accept. Well, un means not so from words like unprofessional, because unprofessional means not professional. It means the opposite of. So you know that means not acceptable. It's something that's not able to be accepted. So thereby using the prefix and the suffix of the word and knowing the meanings of those, the reader can determine the meaning of the word unacceptable. Now some words like backward don't have both a prefix and a suffix. They just have a suffix. So back is the root word, and word is the suffix. So say you didn't know what backward meant, but you knew what the root word meant. You knew what back meant. But you remember the word toward, which also has the same suffix. And you know that means going somewhere. So you could get an idea that this suffix has something to do with direction. So since you see the root word back, you know it means going back to. And so that's another example of how to use the prefix or the suffix to determine the meaning of the word. And some words just have a prefix. This word, for example, has a prefix and a suffix, but no root word. Here, bio is a prefix, and ology is also a suffix. And they share that O. And so you could look at this and think, okay, I don't know what this means, but I know I've seen the word bio before, and the word biography. Well, that's a book about someone's life. So bio must mean life. And then what does ology mean? Well, I've heard of archaeology, and so that must mean the study of something, because you're studying something. So ology means the study of. So by knowing the prefix and the suffix and what they mean of this word, you can conclude that this word most likely means the study of life. So it's important to understand common prefixes and suffixes so that you can determine the meaning of an unfamiliar word. Every piece of writing should have a logical conclusion, and it's your job as the reader to identify that conclusion, mainly for the purpose of helping you to understand whether you agree with the writer or not. Because you don't want to just read a piece of literature, you want to analyze it. So one step in that process to better understanding it is identifying the conclusion to know whether you agree with the writer or not. So now I want to talk about how to identify that conclusion. So you're going to need to infer a lot, or make an inference. And to infer something just means to take what you already know and combine it with something else to draw a conclusion. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to combine two things. What you already know with the info or the information found in the text. So I'm going to draw a double arrow there, because to make an inference, you're pulling these two things together, everything you find in the text, any pre-knowledge you have, and you're pulling that together to draw the conclusion. And generally, a conclusion should be obvious. If a writer does a good job in their writing, then the conclusion should be easily identifiable. Otherwise, you may draw a conclusion that is not the conclusion the writer had in mind. But nevertheless, it's important that you as the reader analyze the writing and identify the logical conclusion. An inference is a piece of information that is implied, not stated. So basically, readers are often required to understand text that claims and suggests ideas without stating them directly. So that's why it's important for readers to understand inferences and how they can be drawn out of a passage. So take a look at this example. Mark made more money that week than he had in the previous year. So there's two possible inferences that a reader could make from this passage. They could infer that the reader made lots of money that week, so much so that they made more in the previous year. So the one thing they could infer is that there was lots of money this week. The other thing they could infer is that there was little money in the previous year. So I hope you see the contrast here. Either there was lots of money made that week, or there was just little money made in the previous year. So those are two possible inferences that the reader could make. The second is, when his coffee arrived, he looked around the table for the silver cup. So here the reader has to infer that the silver cup contains creamer for the coffee. So that's one thing the reader can infer. And from that, the reader can draw that the subject of the sentence, he, always drinks his coffee with creamer. So this sentence right here may not be important to the passage as a whole, but sometimes it's important that the reader infer something so that they can understand the entire passage. A prediction is a guess about what will happen next. So when a reader actively engages in whatever they are reading, they naturally make predictions about what will happen next. And they base these predictions off of what they have read, and what they already know. So by taking what they have read and what they already know, a reader can formulate what they think will happen next in the story. So consider this sentence. Staring at the computer screen in shock, Kim blindly reached over for the brimming glass of water on the shelf to her side. So the reader is naturally going to read this and have an idea of what is going to happen next. And the reader will probably notice the word blindly. So Kim is so caught up in what's happening on the computer, she goes for a drink of water, but since she's caught up on what's going on the computer, she reaches over without really looking at the glass of water to grab it. So the reader is going to assume that she's going to knock over the glass of water. Now, that may not be what happens, but still it's a prediction either way. The prediction may come true, and a prediction may not come true. But a reader is naturally going to make predictions about a passage, and making predictions is part of being actively engaged in what the reader is reading. The purpose of an author is basically why the writer wrote the paper. It's what motivated them to write something. So there's three basic types of motivations or purposes of an author. They either wrote something to inform, entertain, or persuade. So it's important as a reader to understand the purpose of the author because it helps you better understand the text. So generally, it's pretty easy to determine what type of paper something is. So an informative paper is basically when the reader or the writer is just giving the reader facts about something, they're telling them more about something. A paper that is meant to entertain is generally fiction. It's pretty much any kind of fiction work is meant to entertain. Now occasionally fiction will serve a double purpose of also trying to inform, trying to persuade, but generally when something's meant to entertain, generally means that it's some kind of fiction piece. Then finally, the third type, or the third purpose, is to persuade. And this is actually the hardest type to determine because generally an author is going to try to hide that they're trying to persuade you. Because when someone knows they're trying to be persuaded, they're going to be wary or skeptical of the arguments that the writer is throwing at them. So a lot of times a writer will try to disguise their persuasive paper as a paper that's meant to inform or a paper that's meant to entertain, but actually it's meant to persuade the reader. So those are the three main types of purposes of an author: to inform, to entertain, or to persuade. Reading comprehension, 4th grade. When it comes to summarizing text, you need to be able to state the main point of a story. So a summary is just stating the main point of a story. So you're reading an entire story, and then you're just taking the important things and writing about that. If you've ever looked at the back of a book, you'll see a summary on the back of a book. And so there's a whole book that may be 100 or 200 pages, but the author summarizes it on the back of the book so that you get an idea of what it's about. So that's what you're trying to do through a summary. So there's 4 main points that you should remember when writing a summary. Focus, like I already said, on the main idea of the story. Focus on the key points. In other words, you're not worried about little details. You're worried about the important things that contribute to the overall storyline. The third point is focus on the conclusion of a story. Because in most stories, there's some kind of problem. The whole plot is based around some kind of problem throughout the story. Then eventually that problem is resolved. And so that happens in the conclusion of the story. So look at the conclusion of the story and talk about that too in your summary. So you're going to be talking about the main idea of the story, the key points, the problem, maybe a little bit about the main character, and then talk about the end of the story and how the character ended up dealing with his or her problem. And then the fourth point is kind of a longer one. Focus on important information the author wants the reader to know. So throughout the story, you may notice certain points that the author really wants the reader to understand. And so look for that important information and conclude that in the summary as well. And so a summary is typically one paragraph in length. So it's not very long because it does not need to be long because you're not focusing on details, you're just focusing on the overall story. And so remember, again, you're looking for important information. And so we're not interested in details. Try not to even think about the details, just look for the main idea of the story. Now, in some cases, you might be writing a summary for a long story with multiple settings and scenes. And so a summary may be a few paragraphs in length, and these paragraphs give the main points of each major part of the story. And so the summary of a long story always includes a conclusion to wrap up the story as an entirety. So like I said, the summary is usually going to be one paragraph, but if it's a really long story that has lots of different settings, lots of different scenes, lots of different problems throughout the plot, you may need to write a paragraph for each main point or major part of the story. And then for that summary, you're going to write a few paragraphs, and then you're going to write a conclusion that's going to kind of summarize that whole story. And so only make a summary longer than one paragraph if you feel like you cannot include all the important information in one paragraph. So again, a summary states the main point of a story. Supporting details are very important parts of a paper. It can be said that the topic and main idea of a paper is the most important part. But without supporting details, main ideas and topics are irrelevant. So basically, supporting details reinforce a larger point. So a writer will make a point which may take the form of a topic or a main idea of a paper. So the writer makes that point, and then the writer backs up their point with supporting details. And these details are most often found in informative and persuasive text. And this makes sense because if the writer is telling you about something, each main point they make, they're also going to need to back up with more points so that the reader can be sure that they are being told accurate information. Then also in a persuasive text, if the writer is trying to get the reader to do something or to think a certain way, the writer can't just make a bunch of points. They're going to have to back up those points so that the reader will indeed think that way or take that action that the writer wants them to take. And supporting details are often easy to spot because the writer will let you know that those details are coming. A lot of times they'll make a main point and then they'll say something like first, and they'll make us give a supporting detail and second, and give another supporting detail and then say finally, and then give the third supporting detail. Or they might say something like for example or for instance, and that would tip you off that the next supporting detail is coming along. Supporting details need to be two things. They need to be both factual and relevant. Because if something is totally accurate and factual, but it's not relevant to the main idea, then it's no good. The supporting detail needs to be accurate and needs to relate back to the main idea. And if a supporting detail is very relevant, if it pertains to the main idea, but is not accurate, then again, it's no good because what good is information that is not true? So the important thing to remember with supporting details is that basically their job is to reinforce a larger point, and they can be most often found in informative and persuasive text. They're often easy to spot because they're preceded by words like first, second, finally, or for instance, or for example. And the most important thing for details to be is both factual and relevant. text evidence is basically information in a text that backs up the main point or points in general throughout the story. So I want to write up some main points up here about text evidence. So like I said, it supports. The things it supports are the main point or the points throughout the story. So anytime an author makes a claim about something, it's important that they have text evidence, because when they just make a claim, it's not very credible. And so they add text evidence to it to back up that claim, maybe give a statistic or tell something else to back up the main point or points throughout the story. And text evidence also helps the reader draw a conclusion, or it leads to the conclusion throughout the story. So it's important that text evidence is three things: precise, descriptive, and factual. Remember I said that text evidence supports the main point or points in a story. Well, generally a main point and points throughout a piece of writing are going to be very general. They're not going to be very specific. So since these things are very general, it's important that there are some specifics in the paper. So that's why the text evidence needs to be precise. That way your paper isn't vague, or the writer's paper isn't vague. It's also important that this text evidence is descriptive, because again, main points and points are vague, so it's important to have something very descriptive. And it's also important that they're factual, because since the text evidence is backing up or supporting the main points and points, it's important that these facts or this text evidence is factual, so that it's actually credibly backing up the main points and points throughout the story. So what do you do if you come across a question that does not contain a keyword? As a test taker, you've been trained to look for the keyword in the question to help you determine the answer. But if there's no keyword in the question, then where do you go from there to determine the answer? Well, let's take a look at this example, and then I'll show you how to find a keyword. This example is going to say, which of the following would the author of the paragraph likely agree with? So this is going to be our sample question, and as you notice, there's no main point in it. So you just look over this question. Do you see a keyword? Because I don't. So if a question like this occurred on a test and you can't find a keyword in it, and you need to find a keyword to determine the answer, what do? You go to the only other place you can. You look for a keyword in the answers. So it's going to be multiple choice. So look at answer choice A and read that answer and try to find a keyword in that answer. Then once you have determined the keyword in the answer, quickly skim the paragraph to find that keyword. Then go down to answer choice B. Find a keyword in answer choice B and quickly scan the paragraph to find answer choice B. Then continue down through the other letter choices. A lot of times the keywords of the answers will be closely grouped together within one paragraph. So once you have identified the keywords, you'll notice that they're very close to each other, so they're very easy to find, and you can quickly figure out where the keywords are, and then you'll be on your way to correctly answering the question. So remember, if you ever come across a question where there's no keyword, like this example, go to the only other place you can. Find a keyword in the answers, and you will be on your way to picking the correct answer.